Please be advised, Once Upon a Crime is a series depicting true crime incidents in South Africa. The content may not be suitable for sensitive listeners. Listener discretion is advised. The views and opinions expressed during Once Upon a Crime is not that of the SABC and Lotus FM. Hello and welcome to this new segment on Lotus FM's Night Cafe with myself, Keshav Dass. It's a true crime series and it's called Once Upon a Crime. And to do this, we are joined by someone who's very well versed in the world. She is an author and a podcaster. I'd like to welcome Nicole Engelbrecht. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
So let's just jump straight into it. It's episode 1 and this one's called The Station Strangler.
On the 12th of March 1994, two young boys, 10-year-old Elroy van Roy and his cousin Reno, left their home in Strand, Western Cape to help push grocery trolleys at a local shopping centre. They hoped they might earn a few rands in tips to spend on treats and arcade games. The boys worked for a while and then Reno got hungry and they went to a nearby cafe to place an order for hot chips. While they waited for their food, they looked at one of the arcade game machines. The boys were approached by a man who offered them money to play a few games. They eagerly agreed and invited the man to join them. After enjoying their sponsored games, the boys collected their food order and left the cafe to sit on a nearby curb and eat. The man from the cafe approached them again and asked if they could help him to carry some boxes to a nearby train station. He offered them 10 rand each for their efforts. In 1994, of course, to these two young boys, 10 rand would have seemed like a fortune, and they agreed to assist. Halfway to the train station, however, Reno became suspicious of the man as he'd figured out the boxes that they were carrying were actually empty. He told Elroy they should leave. Both boys had heard stories about a man that was killing young boys. That wasn't happening in Strand though, Elroy reasoned. So while his cousin abandoned the mission and headed back to their home, Elroy continued on with the stranger. He didn't return home for dinner that night. Elroy's body was found a week later in Kleinvlei, Easterrivier, 22 kilometers from Strand. The discovery of his body would be the key to ending a series of murders which had plagued the nearby community of Mitchell's Plain and the surrounding communities for 8 years. Elroy van Roy was victim number 23 of the serial killer that had become known as the Station Strangler.
Can you tell us what it was like, the scene, set the scene for us? What was that time like?
Sure, so this is South Africa in 1994, which was really at the time a brewing part of rebirth and struggle. Apartheid had of course fallen and the country was about to celebrate in a sense by holding its first democratic elections in which all South Africans, regardless of race, would be able to cast their votes. For 23 families, though, this freedom really meant very little because their young sons were either missing or had been found dead. And the killer at that time was still haunting the streets of Mitchell's Plain in the Western Cape.
So when was the first victim of this serial killer murdered?
So the first recorded victim of this serial killer that is now known as the Station Strangler was actually 1986. He was Jonathan Carson and he was 14 years old when he was murdered. His body was found on the 3rd of October in 1986 in the fields that surrounded the Modderdam railway station. And these initial victims being found around stations is, of course, what gave the station Strangler his moniker. And Jonathan had unfortunately been sexually assaulted. His hands had been tied behind his back, and his face had been pushed into the sand. So the cause of his death had been strangulation, and he'd been strangled with his own clothing. And this element would actually become the modus operandi of the station Strangler.
So what happened after Jonathan Claessen's body was found?
So between 1986 and in 1988, another 9 victims were murdered. All young boys, all similar in age, all murdered in a similar fashion. And unfortunately at the time, South Africa wasn't really good at identifying series. So this wasn't identified as a series of murders being committed by the same person. And of course, again, at the time, in 1986 to 1988, we were still in the throes of apartheid. And let's face it, the colored communities, black communities, Indian communities in South Africa were not served in the same way as the white communities were by the police at that time. So really, these children's murders were not given the resources and attention they deserved during that time. But then in 1988, the killer actually seemed to go dormant, and for the next 2 years, there wasn't another murder.
Is this sort of strange behavior for a serial killer to go dormant for 2 years?
It's actually very rare. Once a killer has reached 9 victims, because at that point, they would usually start escalating. And what we usually see is they may kill one victim and then there'll be a long pause. And, that first victim may have been just an accident that happened during a sexual assault or something like that. And then the killer will take some time to start up again. But once they get going, the way the station Strangler had already with so many victims, what we usually see is actually the period between murders decreases and becomes months and certainly not years. And that escalation starts to happen. And really the only reasons for a serial killer going dormant is if they've either been arrested and they're in prison for another serious crime, or they've died, or they're seriously ill and they aren't able to overpower victims anymore. And it just really is incredibly strange behavior for a serial killer. But in this case, one more victim was found in 1992. And again, we had this strange period of dormancy for another 2 years until 1994, when really all hell broke loose in Mitchell's Plain.
So what happened at that time?
So in 1994, the serial murderer that we now know as the station Strangler started killing his victims rather than around stations as he had before. He started killing them in the dunes, the sand dunes that surround Mitchell's Plain. And he escalated incredibly quickly at this time, and victims were being found very frequently. Sometimes 2 victims were being found in one day. And the victim profile and the manner of killing were the same as the murders that had occurred in the 80s, which is why the police would eventually tie these together. But the community was just up in arms because, for most of the history, as I mentioned, police had been used as a force against this community and not a service to protect them. So really, they didn't trust police. And now their children were being hunted by a predator. Sometimes, 2 children a day were going missing and being found dead. And really the community of Mitchell's Plain at that time was just, they were willing to take justice into their own hands if they had to. And I think what really piqued police having to take action was over one weekend search, an additional 8 bodies were discovered in the dunes, and they all matched the same victim profile, all bound the same way, all sexually assaulted, so that modus operandi was really, really clear.
So with the community feeling that particular way and they've reached their boiling point, how did the police respond knowing that the community felt more kids were at risk?
So I think at that point, they realized that they had to take decisive action, and a 14-man special task team was put together in February of 1994. It was called the Station Strangler Squad, and the task team was headed up by Lieutenant Johan Kotza. And really, the initial investigation in the 80s was incredibly poor. There was very little resources, and this investigation was really stood in stark contrast to that investigation. They were given, their own incident room at Mitchell's Plain Police Station. They had an additional 3 caravans on the premises for extra room. They were given computers and data capturing assistants. And then they had the police services first profiler, who was Nikki Pistorius. She was flown in from Pretoria to help on the case as well. And they would end up needing all of those resources because thousands of tips started pouring in. And within the first 3 months of that task team being formed, they interviewed more than 2,000 suspects. And you would think that with that number of suspects being interviewed, that, the killer would, this heat on him, that the killer would not commit any more crimes. But we actually did have another victim during this time. And, the police were really getting quite desperate, and they decided, which was quite unorthodox for the time, to release the profile that Nikki Pistorius had put together, as well as an identikit of one eyewitness who believed they had seen the Station Strangler, to the press. And it was that move that ended up leading to an arrest.
So now we speak about the time, and you mentioned the time, and I know that Nikki Pistorius was also very a special person at this time, because back in that time, things are very different. You want to tell us something about that?
Yeah, so, I think Nikki Pistorius was an incredible pioneer, not just in South Africa, but also internationally in profiling. And she's a female. She was working in a male-dominated sort of environment, and she really did incredible work at that time. She was sort of pushing up against this patriarchal world that she was working in. And the reason that she had, of course, come on the scene in South Africa was because South Africa had this surge of serial killers in the 90s. And the reason for that was, very interestingly, actually linked to South Africa becoming a free nation, a democratic nation. And that sort of sadly worked in the favor of some of these men who were serial killers. Because under apartheid, of course, the movement of people was controlled. Mm-hmm. But once we became a democratic country, the people were, as they should be, allowed to move as they wished to. So the serial killers, they had this huge group of what they saw as victims now moving away from their families. These people became vulnerable because they weren't in contact with their families all the time. Mm-hmm. And that is actually one of the reasons that we saw this surge in serial killers at that time. And as a result, actually, South Africa became one of the best countries in the world at catching serial killers, which was it's a sad benefit, but it was a good thing for us, I guess.
Absolutely. Can you tell us more about the man that was arrested for the crimes?
Sure. So Norman Afzal Simons was a teacher in his 30s at the time that he was arrested. And the way that he came to police attention was he was booked into a psychiatric facility for treatment. And one of the nurses that worked at that psychiatric facility actually saw the identikit that had been published in the newspaper, and she thought it looked very much like Simons. So she alerted the police, and he was brought in for questioning. And he was directly asked whether he was the person known as the Station Strangler. And yeah, he responded quite strangely because he didn't directly respond to the question, but he asked for pen and paper and told police that he would write his life story instead. And so he did eventually end up confessing to having committed the murders and claimed he had gone back as far as the 80s. But then in the months before the trial, which is something we actually see quite commonly with serial killers, he started flip-flopping between retracting his confession and then reinstating it. And he did this several times actually. He did point out some of the scenes to the police officers where the crimes were being committed. And although the community was of course relieved that a killer had been arrested, they thought the killer had been arrested, there was also quite a lot of concern about the validity of the evidence against him.
So how did this trial then go with Norman Simmons?
So although we did already have access to DNA technology at that time, okay, but it wasn't nearly as advanced as it is now. So some of the victims had unfortunately been lying outside exposed to the elements for a long time, and the DNA had been degraded because of that exposure to the elements. So it wasn't as useful as it could have been, and because the technology wasn't as good, it was really difficult to get what they felt was useful results. So as a result of that, there was no actual physical evidence tying Simons to any of the victims. He had confessed, but he'd also retracted those confessions. And again, even though he pointed out some of the crime scenes, his defense attorney could and would eventually argue that Simons had only known about those scenes because he had seen them in coverage in media. So the only real evidence that they had that linked Simons was to the final murder, which was the murder I discussed in the beginning of this, which was Elroy van Roy. And there was two eyewitnesses who said they had seen the child with Simons on the day that he was killed. So as a result of that, police had decided to only proceed to trial for that one murder and not the earlier victims. And, you know, there did seem to be quite a bit of circumstantial evidence that linked Simons to the other murders because he had known many of the victims, but this wouldn't stand as evidence in court. And, you know, it was a small, tight-knit community, you know, so many people could have known those victims. But so the prosecution did eventually end up getting a conviction on that single murder based solely on essentially the fact that he had confessed at one point despite having retracted it, and the eyewitness confessions. And he was found guilty and he was sentenced to a life term for that murder in 1995.
But that's not the end of the story for Simons, is it?
No. So in South Africa, it's important to understand that a life sentence essentially means that you will be under the auspices of the Department of Correctional Services for the rest of your life. But that doesn't necessarily mean you will serve the rest of your life in prison. So we have a period of 25 years that you must spend in prison for a life sentence. And then at that 25-year point, you become eligible for parole. And Simons became eligible at 25 years, and at 28 years into his sentence in 2023, he was actually released on parole. So he is now out, out in the community. And, you know, despite the fact that he had earned the moniker of the station Strangler, legally, you know, we saw at the time of his release people being shocked that the serial killer had been released, but legally he wasn't a serial killer because he'd only been convicted of one crime. And I think that's what a lot of people didn't really understand. And you know, there were also a lot of people who didn't believe he was responsible for all the murders in those series. So Simon's own defense attorney was so convinced of his innocence that he was innocent on all those charges that he actually continued to campaign for Simon's release for the rest of his own life, and he actually passed away before Simon's was released on parole. There were, in the ensuing years, there were further investigations done by journalists who have also shown that the quality of the investigation into the series was quite poor, and the evidence against Simons probably wouldn't stand up in court today. And there is one theory that there was actually more than one killer involved in the series, and that not all the victims were actually killed by the same person. There are a lot of people who believe that Simons was not the station strangler, and maybe even that he didn't kill Elroy van Roy. Many years after conviction, the DNA evidence was actually tested again with updated technology. And the results showed that the contributor to that DNA was actually not Simons. And there was also, in some of the samples, they found more than one male contributor to the DNA. And when this information was released to the public, police cautioned journalists to remember that the DNA had been sitting for many years and that it could have been degraded and it could have given false results. But, I just look at that and I think if they had really believed that, why would they have wasted resources testing it in the first place? And also, perhaps, if it had come back as positive for Simons, would they still have given that caution?
Suspicion of there being more people involved in this case, there was a Brian chauffeur theory. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So in 2016, a self-confessed and convicted pedophile, Brian Chauffeur, was found hanging in the police cells at Lentefier police station. 58-year-old Chauffeur had been arrested just days before for the sexual assault of a 17-year-old boy who had been living with them at the time. Chauffeur's arrest had been surrounded by quite a bit of controversy. He'd been released for his initial sentence, which was for a charge which was called molestation and sodomy at the time, in 2010. And while he was initially under the watch of a parole officer, he actually managed to surround himself with children once again when he was on parole. And he started advertising online to tutor children. And although at the time of his arrest, he claimed that all the parents of the students he tutored had known that he had a previous history of sex crimes, this would turn out to be untrue. And I think any parent can imagine that, if they were told that about their child's tutor, they certainly wouldn't still be using them. It also emerged that Chauffeur had actually managed to secure a job at a Cape Town primary school shortly after he left jail, and he was only there for a few months. So Chauffeur had claimed to be completely rehabilitated, and he denied the most recent charge against him. His suicide came after two of his landlords had gone to the media with some quite disturbing claims. And what happened is, between the two men, they had acted as his landlords at various premises throughout the previous 6 years that he'd been out of jail. And both men had been told by Chauffeur that his sentence had been related to what he called a relationship that he'd had with a 16-year-old girl who had lied to him about her age, he claimed, and that he said he'd been charged with statutory rape because it was a misunderstanding. And this was completely untrue. The truth was that Chauffeur had been found guilty in 1994 of multiple charges of rape and sodomy against several boys under the age of 15. And his landlords both separately made statements to the media about having seen children living with Chauffeur over the 6 years that they knew him. The 17-year-old boy that was the most recent accuser of Chauffeur, where he was accusing him of sexual assault, had apparently been living with him since he was 12 years old. And both landlords also said that they believed that chauffeur was actually the real station strangler. He'd reportedly lived in Mitchell's Plain during the same period that the strangler had been active there. He had been a teacher. He'd also lived in Strand. And chauffeur had claimed that his paedophilia had stemmed from sexual abuse he had endured as a child by his uncle. He also said that his father had been aware that his uncle was raping him, but he'd ignored it. Besides the claims that were made by his landlords, chauffeur was also made aware that shortly before his suicide that he was going to be charged with a rape case in Steenberg, a sexual assault case in Mitchell's Plain, a sexual assault case in Hanover Park, and 18 cases of sexual assault involving street children in Strand, where he used to reside. Chauffeur served his initial sentence, quite bizarrely, in the same prison as Norman Simons did. And since those allegations about chauffeur surfaced, unnamed criminal experts have come forward saying that at the time of the Station Strangler investigation, police actually had looked into the possibility of there being two killers with exactly the same modus operandi, or they might have also thought that the Station Strangler had an accomplice. And, chauffeur matches the profile almost exactly, but he doesn't match the identity.
And here we are left with more questions. And that was episode 1 here on the true crime series that we have, Once Upon a Crime. Thank you for joining us for this one. We'll be back with another episode next week.
Shit.